Hey guys, let's talk about how to deal with bitterness in your life, especially if you're a Christian, if you're trying to pursue God and you're in relationships with people and you allow bitterness to sort of creep into your heart because of something they say. If you look up bitterness online, you'll find the definition is the second definition here. It's anger and disappointment at being treated unfairly. It's resentment. And so some of those key words there are you're angry, number one. Bitterness sometimes is called the little brother of wrath. It's not quite as bad as wrath, where you want to take something out on somebody, but in your heart you do, right? That's that anger and disappointment. And a lot of it is really rooted in this sense of injustice. I've been treated unfairly. And Ephesians chapter 4 has something to say to us. If you look there, it says in verse 2, always be humble and gentle, be patient with each other, making allowance for each other's faults because of your love. Now, I encourage you to check out the rest of Ephesians chapter 4. There's a lot of great stuff here, but Paul is sort of setting up this idea, and I think it really relates to bitterness. And we're going to see he's going to come back to this word bitterness at the end of the chapter. But as you scroll down through this chapter, you'll notice that he says this when he starts talking about living as children in the light. And again, he's talking about living this new kind of life, this spirit-filled life, and go back to where he talks about what the fruit of the Spirit is: love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and all those things in Galatians 5. He says in Ephesians here in verse 23, instead, let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes, which is really something that you need if you're struggling with bitterness. You need to have a renewed thought and renewed attitude toward people. He says, put on your new nature, created to be like God, truly righteous and holy. And notice what Paul's saying in these verses. He's saying that you have to participate in this. One thing with bitterness is you can only do your part. You can't make someone else treat you better, but you can do your part in the way you think about somebody else. And so what Paul is saying is you should put on your new nature, and you need to take ownership for what you can take ownership in, rather than trying to punish somebody else in your own heart, because bitterness does that, right? You're trying to punish them, but really bitterness is an inward thing, so you're only punishing yourself. He says this in verse 26, and don't let sin, or he says, and don't sin by letting anger control you. Remember, that's part of the definition of bitterness. It's anger at being treated unfairly. And Paul says in Ephesians 4, don't sin by letting anger control you. Don't let the sun go down while you're still angry, for anger gives a foothold to the devil. You can also say bitterness, inward anger toward being treated unfairly. Bitterness gives a foothold to the devil. I don't know if you notice that in your own life, that when you allow bitterness to fester in your own heart, you're giving a foothold to the devil. And look at how he ends chapter 4, Ephesians 4. He says in verse 31, get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. And look what he says in verse 32. This is sort of the antidote, the remedy. Instead, he said, be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another just as God through Christ has forgiven you. Because listen, as a Christian, you have to understand this. God has every right to be bitter at us, because what's bitterness? Bitterness is anger at being treated unfairly. And think about how Jesus was treated unfairly for our sakes. And yet Jesus forgives us. And this really is the key right here. If you're a Christian, the key to unlocking your bitterness and getting rid of it, defeating your bitterness in your life, is to recognize that as a follower of Jesus, Jesus isn't bitter at you. Rather, he's forgiving, he's tender-hearted, he's kind to you. And so when we're walking in the footsteps of Christ, like it says in verse 32, we should be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, because this is exactly what God did through Christ. When Jesus went to the cross, he was treated unfairly. He died for us there to set us free. And if you need to be set free from bitterness in your own heart, then take a look at Ephesians chapter 4. Read it, pray about it, think about it. Use the resources below this video to talk about it with a mentor or a small group.